You may go, well, I've shared that with my kids before, but I encourage you this week sometime to share that story again if you've shared it before. If you've never shared it, make sure you shared it. I remember one time I was talking with a couple. They were both 88 years old. They'd been married 68 years. They married when they were 20 years old. And they had lived 68 years together. And I'm sitting there in their house and we're talking about things. And as their pastor, I asked the man if he would share with me a little of his testimony. And he began to share about how he came to know Christ. And I began to notice that his wife of 68 years is sitting over there and tears are rolling down her face. And I said, is it emotional that you hear this story again? And she said, I've never heard it before. She said, I know he's a Christian. There's no doubt about that. I see him at church, and I know he taught a Sunday school class for years. I know he was a deacon for years. I know he was very active. I knew he loved Jesus. And that was evident, but I have never personally remembered ever hearing his testimony. Wow. And sometimes with our kids we go, well, I shared it with them when they were 9, or I shared it with them when they were 7, or they were there when I gave my heart to Jesus. We think about that, but we need to be a people who are continually reminding our children why and how. If you go through the New Testament, you see that Paul is telling his story. He's telling his testimony several places. If you go back and you look at Paul's life, his testimony was one that, boy, we could relate to this morning, couldn't we? Wow. He said there is a sudden flash that happens that's brighter than the sun. Boy, we had a lot of flashes this morning. I told Carol that it is fitting right in with my sermon on that illustration because, man, I was taught that you could go flash and then count to the thunder, and that would tell you how far the actual lightning bolt was from you. But this morning, one was like flash. So I said, "Ooh, it's right here." And then all of a sudden I heard all these car alarms in the parking lot going, because the lightning and thunder had set it all off. Can you imagine? Paul says his experience of coming to know Christ was just like that. He's walking down the road to Damascus. He's on his way to destroy Christians, to imprison Christians, to interrogate Christians, to cause life to be problematic for Christians. He's got a sanction from the church. He's excited about what he's doing. He's zealous about it. And on the way, boom, God gets his attention. Changes his world. Everywhere he went, he talked about the amazing God he served and what God had done to his life. Before kings, before princes, before Caesar, before anybody, he presented the message of Christ. And I want to challenge you and I today as fathers to remind our children of what calls us to follow Jesus, to give him our life. And he commends this church and he says, you've got a clear commitment to Jesus Christ. Not just Paul, but he says the church does. I mean, you think about it. In verse 1 of chapter 1, he calls them the saints in Jesus Christ. As a matter of fact, as a Christian, how many of you here this morning think you're saints? Well, let me tell you what. Every believer in this place, you can shoot your hand right up and you can say, I am a saint in Jesus Christ. You may go, oh, not me. Yes, you are. That's the way God sees you. Sainthood is not something a cardinal group of people give you. It's something you are in a relationship with Jesus Christ. And Paul says this church is a church that has a relationship with Jesus Christ. This church is a church of believers. This church is a church that's participated in the gospel. They defended the gospel. They're partakers of the grace of Christ. All those things are found in chapter 1. In chapter 2, he talks about them being people who walk with God, who walk with Jesus, who work in the work of God, working in them. They're living according to the standards of God. They're following God. throughout this book, he just continually reminds us that these people are changed by the gospel. And that change changed what they did with their life. It changed what they did with their giving. It changed everything that was going on. Now you realize, you may not, but you need to realize that this passage, the whole passage, is pretty much talking about giving. How they gave financially. And how they changed everything because of that. So, when you have a clear commitment in Jesus Christ, it refocuses your pocketbook even. Martin Luther said there were 3 conversions to every Christian. The conversion of the heart, the conversion of the mind, and he would call it the conversion of the purse. We would call it the conversion of the wallet or the conversion of the pocketbook, something like that. And he says the last one is the hardest one. But when God's got our heart and He's got our mind, the other follows. And this church is an example of that. So they not only had a clear commitment to Jesus Christ, they also had a clear commitment to the spreading of the gospel. They wanted the gospel to be shared everywhere possible. And I tell you what, one example of my own life that was so powerful from my dad, with it being Father's Day, I'm reminded of that. A lot of people will look at me and they'll go, well, you're a pastor, so your dad was probably a preacher or something like that. No, my dad wasn't a preacher. My dad was a mechanic for 36 years at a chemical plant, and he worked on pumps that pumped cyanide for 36 years. Many of those weeks he worked 60 hours a week. I mean, it was hard work, demanding work, safety challenging work. But one of the things that I was always surprised at is on Thursday evenings, my dad would always try and get home a little bit faster. Because Thursday evening, our church had what we called visitation. A visitation was a time you came together at the church. You were assigned names of people that had visited the church or were friends of people in the church or related to family members in the church or had some contact. And then you would go out and you would talk with those people directly about Jesus Christ. And one of the things that always amazed me is it didn't matter how tired my dad was, 90% of the time when he came home on Thursday night, he ate supper quickly and got ready and went to share Jesus. The most amazing thing for me was, as a kid, watching that happen. Because I knew God not only had my dad as a Christian, but He had my dad's heart and my dad's passion for the spreading of that good news to the area. One of the most amazing memories I will have of my dad was at his funeral. Because there were a couple of things that happened at his funeral. I preached his funeral. But 2 things that were important. My daughters had videotaped my dad sharing his testimony. And at my dad's funeral, he shared his own testimony. The pastor of the church there, he said, I don't think I've ever seen the deceased share their testimony before. He said, that's an amazing thought. And so my dad, even at his funeral, was sharing the gospel. But after that funeral service was over, and people were coming around and greeting the family and talking with me, a number of different people that he worked with walked up to me and said, I'm a Christian today because of your dad. One man said, I hated your dad as a boss. He said, I worked for your dad for 20 years before I became a Christian. But in that whole time, he loved me. In that whole time, he shared with me. In that whole time, he gave me an option for following God that would give hope that I never understood until after giving my heart to Him. So my dad was a dad. My mom also shared But my dad was a dad who shared in this sharing of the story of the gospel. And just think how impactful that was for me. Now this church, they were sharing the gospel, but they were also sharing the gospel through sharing their finances. They were taking care of Paul. Paul says, if you remember, he goes, hey, look, from the very first time, you were part of taking care of things with the gospel. For when I left Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone. For even in Thessalonica, you sent a gift more than once to meet my needs. You see, they were participating with Paul. In verse 1, or chapter 1, verse 5 of Philippians, it says, in view of your participation in the gospel from the first day until now. You see, they were involved. When Paul left the church and went to the next place, they helped fund that. When he went from there to the next place, they helped fund that. When he got to Thessalonica, it's interesting because he says they weren't the ones that took care of him, but the Philippian church was the one who took care of him. Now, I know your thought, remember, you may not remember, but our thoughts sometimes lead with that they were a wealthy church. No, they weren't. Matter of fact, when you compare Thessalonica and the Philippian church, the Thessalonican church was very well off financially, but not nearly as close to God. The Philippian church was a church in poverty. So much so, listen to this. Remember, they wanted to help. They even wanted to help brothers and sisters that were struggling because the government had taken their property, or the church of the Jewish temple had overtaken their stuff. But listen to what he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. Now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God which has been given in the churches of Macedonia, that in a great ordeal of affliction their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. For I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability they gave of their own accord, begging us with much urging for the favor of participating in the support of the saints. Now, I want you to get a picture of this church. This church doesn't have much. They barely got enough to take care of themselves, and yet they're begging for the opportunity to give so that they can help others. One day, I had the opportunity of being along the Chile border in Argentina, in one of the more poor areas of the country. I was preaching in a church that there was one Bible in the whole church. No church member had a Bible except for the pastor's wife. No, his pastor's mother. Sorry. Pastor's mother had a Bible. And what always amazed me about that Bible is the last 5 chapters of Revelation weren't in it. It had been lost somewhere.